Chapter 3 Web of Steel. The tired gladiator leaned forward, his body loose and poised, as he gripped his long sword and let the blade dip towards Adrian. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged, the adamantine sword slicing down with brutal precision. Adrian barely had time to react, bringing up one of his short swords in a desperate block. The impact reverberated his arms, but he spun on his second blade upwards with a quick counter-strike. The gladiator danced back, his footwork impossibly fast and flawless. Each step seemed to glide, his movements so precise that they barely disturbed the sand beneath him. Adrian's mind raced. This was an ordinary skill. His opponent moved with a speed and grace that would have even left the most seasoned of knights bewildered. The gladiator cocked his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Come on," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "Give me another." Adrian's eyes narrowed, studying the man. "Just testing the waters," he muttered, though his mind was anything but calm. He could tell from that brief exchange that this fight would not be won with brute force. The gladiator's speed and precision would demand his full focus and every ounce of skill he had. A fierce determination ignited within him, and he let out a roar, charging forward with both swords raised. His body moved with a relentless fury, his muscles tightening as he closed the distance in an instant. The gladiator's expression didn't change. He sidestepped Adrian's charge with ease, his longsword held at the ready, like an unbreakable barrier standing between Adrian and victory. Adrian swung his right blade down in a powerful arc, aiming to break through the opponent's guard, but the gladiator's longsword rose with a smooth parry, meeting Adrian's strike with a metallic clash that sent sparks flying between them. The sound was deafening, but the gladiator's stance remained unshaken. Adrian gritted his teeth, refusing to relent. He unleashed a flurry of slashes, his twin blades slicing through the air in quick, brutal arcs. The gladiator's movements, however, were as fluid as water. He stepped back, weaving around each strike, his sword blocking and deflecting with a grace that seemed almost divine. The crowd held its breath, captivated by the elegant violence unfolding before them. Adrian feinted left, his right blade snapping up for an opening he had hoped to exploit, but the gladiator's eyes did not waver. He read the feint perfectly, dodging Adrian's true strike with the same effortless ease, leaving Adrian's blade to cut through empty air. "How long have you survived like this?" The gladiator's voice rang out over the sound of Adrian's labored breath. "If you can't land a single strike on a defensive opponent." The words stung more than Adrian wanted to admit. His breath came in heavy gasps, his body strained as he fought to keep up. His opponent, meanwhile, was barely winded, his movements as precise and calculated as ever. Adrian's eyes narrowed, his breath ragged, and he lunged forward, thrusting both blades at the gladiator's chest. The gladiator, with an almost supernatural calm, pivoted out of the way, letting the twin swords inch past his torso. In the same fluid motion, he brought his adamantine sword down in a swift, precise strike, angled just so it would be powerful enough but not being lethal. The blow landed with brutal accuracy, catching Adrian squarely on the shoulder. Pain exploded through his body, and he staggered back, coughing as he felt the force rattle through his ribs. His vision blurred momentarily, the edges of the arena growing hazy. The crowd erupted, their voices a wild mix of cheers and shouts. Some screamed for the gladiator, chanting his name with an almost reverent excitement, while the others roared for Adrian, urging him to press on, to not let his new foe break him. The gladiator lowered his sword, giving Adrian a moment to recover, his eyes calm and unrelenting. "Ready?" he asked, his tone steady, almost encouraging. Adrian blinked, momentarily taken back. He had faced countless foes in the pit, yet none had fought with such precise control, and none have ever given him pause like this. He straightened, with a wry grin tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he replied, forcing confidence into his voice. "You should be ready, though." The gladiator gave a slight nod, recognizing the spark of a challenge in Adrian's words. They began circling each other, each watching for the slightest opening, every muscle coiled in anticipation. Adrian's mind raced as he considered his options. His opponent was too fast, too controlled, evading every strike with maddening ease. But Adrian had survived in the pits because he wasn't afraid to fight dirty. His eyes fell to the sand beneath his feet, an idea forming in his mind. He tightened his grip on his blades, feigning a forward step, and just as the gladiator's attention shifted, Adrian kicked up a spray of sand directly into the man's eyes. The gladiator staggered, his vision blurred by the grit, and for the first time his movements faltered. Adrian saw a chance and didn't hesitate. He darted forward, one of his blades slicing down into the gladiator's calf. The blade bit into the flesh, drawing blood and forcing a hiss of pain from his opponent. Adrian's heart pounded with exhilaration as he saw the slightest tremor in the gladiator's stance, the first sign of weakness. The gladiator's divine aura seemed wavered, his steps no longer as graceful. He still moved with astounding skill, blocking and dodging Adrian's strikes, but his movement had lost a fraction of their perfection. Adrian pressed to the advantage, his swords flashing in a relentless series of slashes. Each one aimed to exploit his opponent's new vulnerability. But, even hindered, the gladiator was formidable. He deflected Adrian's attack with a visible strain, his face a mask of calm determination despite the pain radiating from his wounded leg. His sword movements were still sharp, and his blocks held steady, but the once effortless grace was gone. Adrian's focus sharpened, his confidence swelling with each passing second. He had found a crack in the armor of this seemingly invincible foe. Adrian surged forward, his right sword delivering 2 sharp, precise strikes into the gladiator's left arm. Each blow was aimed to wear down his opponent, to chip away at that near-inhuman resilience. The gladiator grunted, his control slipping just slightly as Adrian continued his assault. With his left hand, Adrian threw an upward chop towards the gladiator's chest, a fierce and calculated strike meant to force him off balance. The gladiator's long sword flashed up in a smooth block, intercepting the blow with a clash that rang out across the arena. But Adrian's relentless pressure was taking the toll. The gladiator's movements had grown visibly labored, the injury to his leg slowing him down, robbing him of the fluid grace that kept him untouchable. In exchange, Adrian's right blade cut into the gladiator's left arm, drawing blood. Crimson seeped from the wound, staining the bandages wrapped around his forearm. The gladiator winced, but maintained his composure. His breath slightly heavier now, the faintest sheen of sweat on his brow. Despite the pain, he managed to smirk, his voice cold and dry as he looked at Adrian. "Impressive," he said, his tone flat as ever. "Did your mother train you?" Adrian's eyes narrowed, anger flaring in his chest. He couldn't tell if it was a joke or an insult, but something about the way the gladiator said it grated on him. Touched a nerve he didn't realize was so raw. He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his swords. "Was that supposed to be an insult?" He spat. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "I was trained by the men who've died in these pits, day after day. And if you're going to waste time trying to figure out who trained me, you're going to end up just like them." The gladiator's gaze softened slightly, his smirk under his mask fading as he lowered his stance. The point of his swords dipped towards the sand as he adopted a posture that Adrian recognized as the fool stance, a deceptively open stance, inviting an attack that could be countered with a devastating speed. But something about the shift in his opponent's body language stopped Adrian in his tracks. "No one here is your enemy, Adrian," the gladiator said, his voice carrying an odd calm and an intensity that seemed out of place in the chaos of the arena. "What happened in the pit? It should stay in the pit. You didn't ask for this, and neither did they." Adrian's grip wavered for a split second, confusion flashing in his eyes. He'd never heard of another fighter in the pit talk like that, let alone in the middle of a fight. The words hung in the air, cutting through the roaring crowd, reaching something buried deep within him. The gladiator was breathing slowly, his gaze steady, but softened with something almost like pity. Adrian's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of trick, some twisted manipulation to get inside his head? But looking into the gladiator's eyes told a different story. This wasn't an enemy taunting him. This was something else entirely. The crowd's chants faded into a dull hum in the background as Adrian stared at the man. His mind was struggling to reconcile the contradiction before him. The gladiator's stance, his words. It was as if he was inviting Adrian to understand something deeper, to see past the brutal mechanics of the survival in the pit. Adrian gritted his teeth, trying to push the strange sentiment aside, but the gladiator's words echoed in his mind, unsettling him more than any strike ever could. Adrian's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he looked at the gladiator, the man's calm eyes seeming to see right through him. "They could stop this," Adrian said bitterly, his voice barely more than a whisper, anger and despair lacing his words. The gladiator's expression didn't change. His tone was calm, even sympathetic, as he replied, "They can't, and you know that." A wave of boos rippled through the crowd, frustrated as the apparent lack of action. The tension in the arena was palpable, the audience demanding blood. Adrian's fists clenched around his blades, his fury building as he glared at the man before him. "You don't know shit," Adrian yelled, his voice raw. "You don't know them, and you sure as hell don't know me." His anger burned away any confusion, any doubt. With a primal roar, he charged, both swords poised to strike with renewed fury. As he closed in, the gladiator raised his hands to his head, pulling away the wraps that concealed his face. Time seemed to slow as Adrian caught the side of the orchid-colored hair spilling down, the unmistakable elven features, and the haunting red eyes. Gasps echoed through the arena, the crowd stunned by the revelation. It was him. The elf Adrian had seen watching him before, the one whose gaze felt like it pierced through him. The elf's face was impassive as ever, yet his presence seemed to radiate something powerful, something that defied words. His jawline was stronger than any elf Adrian had ever seen, a subtle reminder to his strength and resilience. Golden earrings adorned his right ear, but his left bore a striking emerald that dangled in the sunlight, catching Adrian's eye. Everything about him felt otherworldly, as if he existed on a plane just beyond reach. Adrian's mind spun, the shock of the revelation almost breaking his stride, but he forced himself to refocus. To push aside the surprise attack, he swung his right sword with all his strength, but the elf's movements were swift. Practice. He caught Adrian's blade with his long sword, twisting his wrist in a single fluid motion that sent the weapon clattering to the ground. Adrian let out a curse, bringing his left blade down in a desperate slash, but the elf dodged it with dancer's grace, sidestepping before sweeping his leg low and sending Adrian sprawling to the ground. Before Adrian could react, the elf was standing over him, pointing his adamantine sword level, just inches from his lips. "I thought I knew the gladiator," the elf said, his voice carrying a note of conviction. "I thought they were like me, raised as I was. And they were. Tortured, beaten down, taught to hate the world." His gaze softened, a hint of something unspoken flickering in his red eyes. "But you could be better." Adrian's mind whirled, the elf's words striking something deeper than him, something had buried beneath years of pain and anger. But he wouldn't let this stranger see that. Every word felt like a knife, driving deeper into the wounds that he'd hidden from the world. With a scream of defiance, Adrian twisted his head and bit down on the blade, feeling the cold metal slice into his tongue and cheek. Blood filled his mouth, but he didn't care. Pain was familiar, a reminder of his will to survive. He spat blood, a mix of rage and raw desperation burning through him. He swung his left leg up in a fierce kick. The elf staggered back, surprised by the sudden ferocity. Adrian rolled away, wiping the blood from his face as he pushed himself up, his vision hazy, but his resolve unbroken. As he steadied himself, Adrian's gaze drifted towards the gate. The portcullis was beginning to rise, creaking upward as reinforcements began spilling into the arena. He could see shapes of other figures, more men in armor, stepping out as the crowd roar grew to a feverish pitch. A surge of energy filled him, fueled by anger, desperation, and the need to defy every force that had tried to break him. This wasn't over. Not yet. Adrian's heart thundered as the realization sank in. Guards. Crown guards. Their crests unmistakable even under the harsh glare of the arena's midday sun, or advancing with grim purpose. The familiar livery of the crown marked over them as agents of the kingdom, their armor gleaming and helmets casting long shadows over their faces. But why? A chill ran through Adrien. Guards had no place in the pit. The arena was blood-soaked sands were ruled by the law of combat, not the crown. Their presence here was a breach, an unnatural shift that sent a ripple of fear through him, stronger than any anger. He could feel the crowd's growing confusion, the uneasy murmurs spreading through the stands. Something was deeply wrong. He glanced at the elf, the gladiator, who was watching the guards with a steady, calculating gaze, his crimson eyes sharp, hinting at a knowledge Adrian didn't yet grasp. The calm, even serene expression on the elf's face had grown darker, and Adrian could see a hard resolve there, the shadow of something fierce and resolute. The elf's gaze flickered back to Adrian, and he spoke in a sharp, commanding voice. "Adrian, follow my lead." Without hesitation, the elf surged forward, his movements no longer graceful, but deadly. He closed the distance between himself and the nearest knight in a flash, his purple adamantine sword slicing through the air. The blade found its mark, piercing the knight's neck with a sickening precision. The elf yanked his sword free, the motion nearly decapitating the guard. Blood sprang across the sand. The elf didn't pause. His momentum carried him into the second guard, his blade cutting through the armor and flesh with terrifying ease. The guard's armor clanged as he fell, lifeless to the ground. Another knight moved from the side, but the elf met him with a fierce kick to the chest, sending him sprawling back, incapacitated. Adrian stumbled, momentarily caught off guard by the elf's swift, lethal movements, but he quickly regained his focus, his senses sharpening as he felt the rhythm of battle settle over him. This wasn't a fight for spectacle, this was survival. Out of the corner of his eyes, Adrian saw a glint of metal. Another knight sneaking up behind the elf, sword poised to strike. His instincts screamed at him. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he lifted his short sword and surged forward. His blade found the knight's shoulder, piercing through his armor, driving him into his knees. The knight staggered, his grip on his sword slacking as Adrian wrenched his own blade free. He didn't pause. He drove the knight to the ground with a brutal shove, the sound of metal scraping on metal blending with the din of chaos surrounding them. Adrian glanced at the elf, who acknowledged him with a brief approving nod before turning to face the next wave of guards. They both understood whatever had brought the crown's knights into the pit. They were now forced to fight together.